First baseman Lou Gehrig hung up an amazing mark by playing in 2,130 consecutive games. Then a fatal disease attacked baseball's Iron Man. In Yankee Stadium, touched to tears by the tribute, Gehrig made his last public appearance.
For the past 2 weeks, you've been reading about a bad brag. Today, I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. When you look around, wouldn't you consider it privilege to associate yourself with such a fine-looking man as is standing in uniform in this ballpark today? That I might have been given a bad break, but I've got an awful lot to live for. Thank you.
Today's guest joins other Monday Morning Critic authors and writers such as Lois Lowry, Andy Weir, Daniel Wallace, Bob Ryan. He's the author of The Luckiest Man, Life and Death Story of Lou Gehrig, The Opening Day, the story of Jackie Robinson's first season, Get Capone, the secret plot that captured America's most wanted gangster, The Birth of the Pill, and his most recent release, The Wonderful Ali, A Life. Jonathan Eig, how you doing today, my friend?
I'm great, thank you.
Sorry for that hour and a half introduction. So there's so much I want to talk to you about. It all starts for me. So I'm listening to WFAN. I want to say this is obviously, 13 years ago. And I think it's Francesa that's talking about this book he read about the life of Lou Gehrig. Long story short, it's your book. I read it 3 times. I'm weeping every time I read it. So I wanted to talk to you. So I know you're a journalist and you're an author of 5 books. You've got an award for ESPN. You got many awards, but you got the prestigious ESPN Award for Literary Sportswriting. Where's your inspiration lie? Where does it all come from? Where does it all start for you, Jonathan?
Well, that first book was a biography of Lou Gehrig, and I'm a huge Yankee fan. Never dreamed that I would someday get to write the biography of one of my heroes. But I was a newspaper guy for a long, long time, and then I worked up to magazines, and I started thinking about writing books. And I just love telling stories. I wasn't a good enough athlete to make a living at it, but at least writing about athletes is almost not. It's not as much fun, but you can have a longer career. So I was really lucky that I hit on this idea for writing a book about Gehrig, and that it gave me a chance to write more books.
Yeah, and every time I ask a writer who their inspiration is, I swear to God, I get Kurt Vonnegut all the time. Do you have somebody that kind of is at the core of why you love doing this? And let me just say, Jonathan, as well, and I'm talking a mile a minute here, you are a gifted storyteller. So while, there's Ali's and there's the Gehrigs of the world, the storytellers of the world are from somebody who loves movies and reading, my God, you are so gifted at doing this.
Oh, that's very nice of you. I grew up reading the sports pages, so and reading the newspaper columns. So guys like Jimmy Breslin and Red Smith were big inspirations to me. And then as I got older and started reading books, not Vonnegut. I liked Vonnegut okay, but he just seemed like he was on another planet. I couldn't ever write like that. But the book that really got me excited and gave me the idea to try writing the Lou Gehrig book was Seabiscuit by Laura Hillenbrand. That book just knocked me off my feet, and I started trying to figure out how she did it. And when I started taking that book apart, I started thinking about how maybe I could try the same thing and write about a baseball player in sort of the same way she wrote about that horse.
No, and I'm totally on board with you on that. And what I did there, Jonathan, was they did a great job of taking that book and making it into a wonderful movie. When I'm reading your book or I'm going through a lot of this information, this research, I'm wondering when somebody in Hollywood, because I'm a movie guy predominantly, when somebody's going to pick one of these things up and make it into a movie. And I know there's been movies about Gehrig. I get it, but they're all one patterned after another. The way you look at things is a really kind of, I don't want to say humane, it sounds so stupid. It's just such a grounded type of view. I love how you perceive athletes, the way you question, the way you make them look like people, not like idols or somebody you'd worship on a Sunday or a Saturday.
Well, that's a big part of it is, so many books, especially in sports, we tend to make these guys out to be like mythological figures. And the movies do that too. Al Capone, for example, it's not just the athletes. And when you do that, you forget that they're real people. And when you forget they're real people, then you don't really relate to them. And readers should be able to relate to these figures, should be able to imagine what it would be like to know them or even possibly to be them. So I try to strip away some of the bull and get at what these guys were really like. And as far as the movies go, we're trying. There's a really good script for the Lou Gehrig book right now that's going around, and we've got a director and trying to see if we can get that made. The Yankees are actually helping to back that project. And CBS is working on a mini series based on my Ali book. So fingers crossed, maybe some of that will. Maybe something else will catch on. You
just made my day, and you realize this means you have to come back a second time. You're obligated. You know that, right?
Well, at least a couple more times, because if we do the movie and then the TV show, we got to do one talk for each one.
So you as I said, your storytelling ability. You bring things down to the core. You studied at Northwestern. You're born in Brooklyn. So, and I know what you've said, earlier in the interview, but is there I always ask people about a mentor, or I know mom was a stay-at-home mom. I know dad's an accountant. Where do you attribute your ability to kind of just do this? Is it just experience to tell a story? Is it all of these things? Is it Northwestern? What is it?
The great thing about being a newspaper reporter, and back when I was coming out of college, just about anybody could find a job. But as a newspaper reporter, newspapers were booming and hiring like crazy. But the great thing about newspaper reporting is that you can just practice a lot. You might write 10 stories a week. So there were days when I would write 7 or 8 stories, in a single shift. So you just get a lot of practice. I had nobody in my family that knew how to do this. I had nobody growing up that, in my neighborhood who I'd ever met who did this kind of work. I never met a writer until I went to college, and, some of my professors were writers. So I think it just came from the idea that if I can write newspaper stories, if they'll let me do that, I'll keep doing it till I get better at it, and I just loved it and wanted to do it as much as possible.
Yeah, and I read somewhere where for a while or for a brief period you did teach writing.
Yeah, I've tried teaching it a few times, but it's too hard and doesn't pay well enough.
Yeah, it's very difficult. If you had to and this is probably an impossible question after you just said that, if you had to filter it down to maybe 2 or 3 things, and I asked Andy Weir this same question. He's like, it's almost impossible. But if you had to filter it down to 2 or 3 things, what would you tell somebody who wants a kid who has aspirations of becoming a writer? What would you bring it down to as far as 2 or 3 mechanical things? Would you say read a lot, write a lot? One of Andy's things was he said, write and don't care what people say. Just keep writing and writing and writing. I mean, that was part of his advice. What would you say?
Yeah, I'd go along with that. I mean, you certainly have to read a lot, and you have to read carefully and pay attention and try to learn from what you're reading. And then you got to write a lot. It's just like anything you want to be good at. There's repetition. You get better at it the more you do it. But I think, like Andy said, you have to give yourself permission. You have to say, I don't care if I don't need anybody's permission but my own to write this book. Whether it's a novel or whether it's a biography. When I thought about doing the Lou Gehrig book, there was a part of me that said, well, I don't know if would I have to get like the family's permission? Would I have to get the Yankees' permission to write a biography of Lou Gehrig? But then I just decided, what, I'm just going to try and see what happens, and maybe no one will stop me. And I think that's really key. You got to give yourself permission to just do it. And if you do it well, you might get to do it again.
That's really well said, and does it matter to you, and this is my most elementary question on the whole page, I promise, does it matter to you how you, Jonathan Eig, read a book, whether it's audio, iPad, or hard copy? Are you one of those people that it has to be hard copy, or you don't care how a book gets into you? What's your preference?
I definitely prefer to read a hard copy. I prefer to hold it in my hand. I just feel like I focus better when even if I don't have any other tabs open on my screen. If I'm reading it on a device, I tend to be distracted, and then I'm not really paying attention, and then I'm not really learning anything, and not getting any better at what I do. Every time I read a beautiful sentence, I think I can learn from it, or at least try to emulate it. So if I'm not really engaged, then I'm not getting everything out of it that I can.
So, one of the things that I'm looking at is I was wondering how you get the people. I mean, I know why. So you have Gehrig, you go into Jackie Robinson, Capone, Ali, and you're working on Martin Luther King, which I'm going to get into. How do you get your subjects? Because, like, in the podcast world, when I get a guest, like when I ask Jonathan Eig to be on my show, it's because I'm head over heels for your work. I want to get you on my show. I want to hear what you have to say. In the podcast world, we have, like, some podcasters use, like, a paid service where they kind of just get any guest and they just give them whomever. Like, I can't imagine if they did that to you, if they just said, okay, here's so-and-so, write about him and spend all that time interviewing and researching. Here you go. You wouldn't be as passionate. So how do you get to why these guys and why the people that you choose? Why write about them, Jonathan?
Well, you got to find something you're passionate about, or else why do it? I'm not getting rich doing this. If nobody's throwing $1 million at me and saying, "Here, go write a book about Reggie Jackson." I'm doing the books that I want to do, and I'm hoping that they'll sell. I'm trying to pick subjects that I think might make money for me and might find a big audience, but that's only one of the factors. It's got to be something that I'm passionate about, and it's got to be something that I think I can find something new to say about it. It would be really hard to write another book about Joe DiMaggio after the job Ben Kramer did, so I'm not going to do that. And I also just feel like if it's just a baseball story, that might not be enough to hold my interest for 3-4 years of work. It's got to have some cultural meaning or some other depth to the characters that makes it work for you. So it's everyone is a tough. That's the hardest part, is choosing the right subject. I think that you live or die based on your choice of subject.
So let's just take Gehrig, because it's one of my favorite books of all time. How much time invested in that complete book on your behalf?
It's about 4 years, from getting the idea to researching the idea to writing the proposal. That was about a year. And then after I wrote the proposal and sold it, there was another 2-3 years of research and writing, and then 6 months of editing. And I guess, I'd say 3-4 years is about the minimum that I spend on a book.
Have you ever gone down a road where you say to yourself, something, this person seemed interesting, but you know what? It's not enough to make me invest 3 or 4 years. You don't have to obviously name a name, but have you ever been in
all the time?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and hopefully you only spend like a week or two on it before you decide that this is a bad idea. But there was one I spent a year on, and I really just couldn't decide whether to go ahead with it or not. And ultimately, I pulled the plug and dropped it after a year of work. I got nothing but a file cabinet full of papers out of it. I didn't make a dime, but I think it was the right decision. You just don't want to get in bed. You don't want to get in bed with somebody unless you're really going to marry them.
Right. Case. Yeah, no, that makes sense, because you were a year into it. You don't want to get to the point where you're 3 and 4 and decide, geez, this really is not my style. This is not what it's about. So yeah, you're right with that. How do you like book tours, Jonathan? Do you find them enjoyable? Do you enjoy getting out there, or is it kind of tedious for you?
I love it. I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit how much I love it, because hell, somebody wants my autograph. They want me to sign a book. That's ridiculous. That's awesome. And you spend 3 or 4 years on this thing, and you never know if it's going to be, if it's ever going to get done, and you don't know if people are actually going to want to read it, if it's going to sell or not. And then you get maybe 3 or 4 weeks. If you're lucky, you get 2 or 3 months of attention, and you get to go talk about your work, and you get to talk to readers, and you feel like you've accomplished something, and then you go back into your cave and get back to work again. So those little moments where you get to come up for air are really fun for me. Yeah,
I told you off the air, I was watching you on C-SPAN. You were promoting your Ali book, which came out in 2017. And you told the ultimate dad joke, which was a quote from Ali, where you showed people the world's fastest jab. It's like the fastest gun in the West routine. I thought that was really great.
That hurts to hear it called a dad joke, because I get that from my kids way too much.
No, but Ali was an amazing guy, and I have to ask you a little bit about each of these people. So, when it came to Gehrig, what did you learn? I mean, I know we all know the things that we know about Gehrig, right? Just a superior human being. What did you learn? When all was said and done, what did you take away?
My biggest surprise was just how unbelievably insecure the guy was. He was a mess. Like, I think he was probably like so shy that he was. I'm willing to bet that he was really depressed at times because he just didn't know how to be a man in that clubhouse. He was young, and he was, mama's boy, and he just never really learned how to hang with the guys. And I felt for him. I really came to find that he was a sweetheart. And it took a lot of courage to be that way, to not to give into the peer pressure and just to, go along with the rough guys in the clubhouse. He was just incredibly insecure, and I kind of loved him for that.
Yeah, and I went through my copy and I highlighted all the things I thought were interesting. Mom loses 3 kids before 12, and she kind of makes, I don't want to say makes Lou pay for it, but what's the right way to phrase this, John? How does she, you can't say take it out on Lou. How would you phrase it?
Well, she like smothers him, I
guess.
Guess.
Smothers him.
She makes him, she blankets him so thoroughly and makes it impossible for him to really gain any independence. And if you think about it, Babe Ruth, he lost a bunch of siblings too.
Right.
I've just read Jane Levy's new Babe Ruth book that's coming out in a couple months. I got an advance copy, and I didn't know that Babe Ruth lost a bunch of siblings as well. And he grew up totally different from Gehrig. His parents stuck him in an orphanage, but it didn't have to be that way for Lou.
No, and what I also took away from that too, Jonathan, was I think he might have been bullied in high school.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. Some reader, everybody, Gehrig, because he didn't talk too much, he kind of becomes like a Rorschach test. People see what they want to see in him. Some people thought he was gay. Some people thought he was bullied. Some people just, it's interesting, but he definitely seemed to be suffering and struggling at times.
Yeah, and The Right Hands, I'm telling you, this has potential to be one of those movies that people remember for decades, of this book into a movie. I mean, the book's phenomenal. He's just, like you said, a fragile guy, and I didn't know he spoke against the color line. My God, I mean, all this stuff, like back, we can say it now because many people are on that page, but back then for Gehrig to do that says a lot about him.
Yeah, Gehrig and Ruth went barnstorming, and they played with a lot of those guys from the Negro Leagues, and they must have spent enough time to get to know some of them. They certainly saw their talent. So, and Gehrig was the victim of anti-German bias. He was growing up during World War I, and a lot of German players were changing their names back then to try to sound less German. So he knew what it was like to be a victim.
And the real cool thing, that one of the coolest things that I read in that book was he would come home from a Yankees game and then play a pickup game with kids from the neighborhood. Are you kidding me?
Yeah, I think Willie Mays sometimes did that too. He would just go out on the street and play catch with the kids. He loved the game, and he was just a little kid at heart. And it's beautiful, really.
So I think at the end of the day, what you take away from Gehrig was possibly, how insecure he was. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, and then how damn strong he was when he got sick. We all know the speech, but I found 200 pages of letters that he wrote when he was dying that nobody had seen before, except his doctor. And they show you the real spirit of the man, because he didn't know anyone was going to be looking over his shoulder at these letters, and the bravery and the positive attitude about life in those letters is something I'll never forget.
Hearing you say that reminds me of what adults tell kids. Character is doing the right thing when no one's watching, and he exemplifies that more than anyone. Is that a fair statement, Jonathan?
Yeah, no doubt about it. He in the privacy of those letters, he easily could have whined or expressed some depression or asked why me, and he never did. Yeah,
man. And the next person, Jackie Robinson. We're talking about on the subject of tough. What did you learn and take away from Jackie Robinson?
Yeah, again, like there's so many things about him that I thought I knew and I didn't. But the big thing for me was that year, 1947, when he broke in. People think that Pee Wee Reese embraced him and that the Dodgers took him in, but nobody embraced Jackie Robinson that first year. Not until the team started winning. Maybe like August or so. Then they started saying, well, World Series paycheck might be nice, and having that Negro on the team, that could really help. So then they started coming around, but Jackie and Rachel were all alone that year. They didn't even have their own apartment. I mean, they couldn't afford. They didn't think that there was any point in taking a lease because they might be gone after a week. And people forget that this was an experiment, and experiments usually fail the first time. So they were really living on the edge. They had a little baby, and they're just renting a room from a stranger. So I wanted to give people a sense of just how dicey that was. What an enormous risk they were taking in bringing him up when they did.
Yeah, and it's no question that the stress eventually, I think, in my own opinion, took a toll on his life. But my question to you is, we look at a guy like Jackie Robinson, we look at the Negro Leagues. I wonder, this is such a huge had it not existed question, but had segregation not existed, you wonder how the Hall of Fame would look now, because there's a bunch of people in there that were okay players, where the Negro Leagues had some phenomenal baseball being played, and you wonder how that would have changed had they become major leaguer. I wonder about that dynamic, Jonathan.
Yeah, there's no telling. It sure would have been different. You would have had a lot more African Americans in the Hall of Fame for sure. You would have had a lot of white guys out of work because they wouldn't have been as much room for them in the majors, and it would have changed the game. You would have had a much higher quality. Some people say, well, Babe Ruth wouldn't have hit 714 homers if he had to face Negro League pitchers all the time, and that's probably true. But I think the whole quality of the game would have been raised, and certainly Babe Ruth still would have been the greatest home run hitter of his era, but he would have faced some tougher pitchers for sure.
Yeah, and a couple more for you. What did you take away from Al Capone? I mean, we all know the stories. What did you take away?
Again, we do this guy a real disservice by mythologizing him and turning him into a snarling cartoon character with a Tommy gun in his hand. He was a complicated guy, and he was actually like a great sports fan. He was a likable person. People enjoyed hanging out with him. He was a good guy to have a beer with. You didn't want to do business with him, but I wanted people to see that for him to succeed the way he did, for him to run this operation for close to a decade and to get famous and to not get shot and to stay out of jail all that time, he must have had some smarts. And he did. He was a smart, savvy businessman, and I think you need to understand all of that, not just take him as the way that you saw De Niro playing him in the movies.
Yeah, there's a very likable quality for sure, and this next guy, Ali, which is the next book on my list here. I get caught on little things, and the way you research things is so amazing. Like, you measured the distance between his home, like the house he grew up in, between the neighbors' houses, and how close it was, right? It was like 72 inches. Like,
yeah, that's
right. You are the most thorough. Like, I take pride in my research, and then I researched you, and then I felt like a jabroni. Like, I'm like, my God, this guy makes me look like nothing. So,
a jabroni, I like that.
Talk a little bit about, Ali and what you took away from him.
Well, yeah, I just had this line in the book where I wanted to say that the view out his window was the next house. And but I thought, well, that could be, a mile away, or it could be, and I wanted to show that it was a small, working class neighborhood, and so I took a tape measure out there and measured. It was 72 inches. But, my big thing is, I don't want anybody to find anything that they can criticize about the book, and I don't want somebody else to come along after me and say I can do it better than him. So I'm trying to just make sure I don't miss a thing. So I go after all of his FBI records. I interviewed all of his ex-wives. I interviewed something like 300 people for this book, and I just tried to think of everything that I could possibly think of. And I came along a little bit late. Some of the guys I would have liked to interview were already dead. But on the other hand, I found all the business records from the Louisville sponsoring group that managed his career. So that you wouldn't have been able to find that stuff if you wrote this book 20 years ago. So I just try to be as thorough as I can.
Yeah, and I mentioned research, and the one thing that you and I have in common is interviewing people. What works for you? I mean, it's tough sometimes because people just say no. There's a lot of things you experience when you ask somebody to be interviewed. What have you learned in that part of this job, Jonathan? The interviewing part, calling people out of the blue, which I could not sympathize. I can relate to all of this. Talk about the interviewing aspect of your job. Like, what have you learned? What advice can you give him to somebody like me?
Well, we could do hours on that subject, but it's tough. People say no a lot at first, and you just have to be persistent, and you got to find their button. What's going to get them to talk. In the case of Ali's second wife, she said no. She wanted to be paid for the interview, but then I found some of her old wedding photos, and I started sending them to her, and she appreciated that. And she began warming up to me a little bit, and then she found, like most people find, that they like it when someone listens to them, and I like it that you're asking me questions now, right? It makes me feel good. It makes me feel like my opinions are worth something, even if it's only to you. So people like it if you're a good listener, and if you ask smart questions, and if you say that you're going to tell their story and you're going to tell it fairly and honestly. And I think eventually, you can wear most people down and get them to come around. But not everybody. You just have to be persistent and be a good listener. I think that really helps.
I've been at this part of it for 16 months, and I can just never find the right words to tell somebody, please let me, because I am so moved by your work. Please let me talk about your life for a half hour to an hour. Please let me ask you. There's no way I've found up to this point, Jonathan, where that works for me. Whether it's an actor, an author, whomever. It's just I don't have the right words. But my intentions, like yours, are completely pure. Yeah,
and it's especially hard in this age when everything's being conducted electronically. You send somebody a text message or an email, and you can't really get across your humanity that way. You got to get face to face with them if you're going to really have a chance of convincing them to talk to you. But sometimes it's hard just to get them to let you in the door, just to make that pitch. So it just takes a lot of work, and that's one of the nice things about working on a book is I've got 3 or 4 years to try to convince people to talk to me.
I love following you on social media. I'm going to talk about your next project. Hopefully you're comfortable talking about it as well, and that's Martin Luther King Jr. What can you say? What have you learned so far? When is the expected release date of that book? Anything you can shed on this topic, I would appreciate.
King is the ultimate example of what we've been talking about. How we've taken these people and we've robbed them of their humanity. We've turned him into a saint. We've turned him into a statue. We've turned him into a national holiday. And we forget that he was a real guy and that he had struggles and that he had feelings. And I want to write a book that makes him real again and lets people know what he really accomplished, and that it wasn't all preordained. We tell the story with all the successes. We don't tell about all the struggles. And I want to, there's a lot out there that people don't know about him. I'm shocked at how much I'm finding that people don't know about him. And there's still a lot of people around who knew him. He would have been just about 90 years old now. So, people who knew him, some of them are quite a few of them are still around. They're getting up there in years. So it's a good time to do this. And there's a lot of new information available in terms of letters and FBI records, that sort of thing. And as for when, oh man, it's going to take me at least 4 or 5 years.
Well, that's visit number 3 and 4 back to the Monday Morning Critic. So here we go.
All right, you got me all lined up until the
they're adding
turn
up.
Of the next century.
So you had 2 guys kind of help you with this. One of them is one of my top 5 favorite actors. The other is one of the world's best filmmakers. That is Morgan Freeman and Ken Burns. How have they helped you in this process, Jonathan?
No, I'm helping them. I hope. Ken Burns is working on a documentary about Ali, and it'll probably be 2021. And it'll be, I think, 3 parts, maybe 4. It'll depend on how much good stuff we get. But I'm I'm a consulting producer on that, so I'm just along for the ride and helping out as any way I can. And Morgan Freeman's production company is working on a TV miniseries for CBS, and we're just starting to do the writing on that, and hoping that it might go into production this fall if everything goes well.
Yeah, I mean, do you ever have to pinch yourself? I mean, like, I'm working with one of the best filmmakers in history. I'm working with one of the best. I mean, does it settle? I mean, people are going to know. This is going to all explode at one time. I mean, you're popular as is, but this is. I'm telling you, I've seen when you have someone who can see things at its core. Spielberg is like this in a lot of ways in his own way. All the great ones are able to get to people's core, and that's what all the successful people do. And I tell you, Jonathan, this is all gonna hit home for you right away. You're gonna see. You mark my words. All
right. Then when that happens, I'll come back to you again, and we'll talk about it some more. But yeah, I do have to pinch myself sometimes that I'm getting to write books for a living. Like, how lucky is that? Mm. B, I'm writing about some of the most exciting lives of the 20th century, people who are just so interesting, and like, it's ridiculous that I get to be Muhammad Ali's biographer. I just don't know what I did to deserve that, but I'm thrilled about it.
What do your own children think, Jonathan?
They don't give a damn.
I don't believe that.
They're not impressed at all. I tell you, not at all.
Jonathan, one of the last few questions I had for you was about ALS, the disease itself. You know, it's a disease that is such a cruel disease by nature, the effects it has on people, how it progresses. Talk a little bit about that portion of Lou Gehrig.
One of the really nice things about writing about Gehrig is that I've gotten to meet a lot of people with ALS and people whose families have been touched by ALS. And I don't know what it is, but I think that disease, it either happens to hit the strongest people, or it just brings out the strength in people, because it's one of the worst diagnoses you can possibly get. And yet I meet one person after another who's got that same strength, the same courage that Lou Gehrig showed. And it's something that has really been inspiring for me.
Yeah, and I don't know if it was a quote or what it was, but I thought it was from your book where Gehrig couldn't talk anymore, but he was still mouthing what the doctors told him about 50-50. Do I have that right, Jonathan?
Yeah, he just kept saying 50-50, and I think he knew that, it wasn't true, but he didn't want to depress everybody around him. He wanted them to feel like, I got this covered, and it's going to be okay. He just wanted to give some comfort to the other folks, in his life.
I don't know. We hear a lot about the negative in the world, Jonathan, but there's an awful lot of positive as well.
Yeah, and Gehrig reminded us of that. He found out he was dying, and all he could do was stand up there and thank everybody for giving him so many wonderful memories.
I did have one more question, pertaining to Gehrig. Did he and Ruth have a good rapport? It's always back and forth. I hear no, I hear yes. I think it's yes, right? They had a good rapport and respect for each other.
Yeah, I think they loved each other, especially in those early years, and it got a little dicey toward the end. There was supposedly some rumors about Lou's wife maybe having slept with the babe back before she married Lou, and there was some gossip. And then when Lou became the captain of the team, and when Ruth started to fade, and when he was let go by the Yankees, and then the relationship kind of splintered. But when Gehrig got sick, Ruth was right there. When he died, Ruth was the first one to get to the house to express his sympathies. I think that overall, on balance, they had a really warm relationship.
And my last question is, I know you mentioned Laura Hillenbrand, your work. What sports movies do it for you? So, like, the other day I was watching The Natural. I can go word for word. I can't tell you what I had for breakfast this morning, but I can tell you Roy Hobbs' words word for word. What sports movies do it for you, Jonathan?
Oh, wow. I love boxing movies. I love Bull Durham. I love Field of Dreams. The Seabiscuit movie didn't do it for me. It wasn't half as good as the book, I thought. Not a big fan of the Will Smith Muhammad Ali movie. That's
we agree on that.
Yeah, I wasn't crazy about that one. But almost any baseball movie is gonna be pretty good, except for that Babe Ruth movie.
Oh, with John Goodman.
With John Goodman, I can't. That's a disaster.
Yeah.
But baseball movies are almost always, there's always something to like in those.
Yeah, I interviewed Greg Olson, the interview before you. He was a closer for Baltimore, and his favorite was, it's one of the most underrated ones. It's For the Love of the Game with Kevin Costner. I agree. I like that movie. It's a great movie.
Yeah, Sandlot is a good one.
Yeah.
There's a lot.
Jonathan, is there anything you wanted to promote? Get out there. I mean, I am going to get, my next move is to get Ali by this weekend. So is there anything you wanted to promote?
No, buy the books. Buy any of them. Keep authors alive. Please do some reading, everybody. And if you want to pick my books, that would be nice.
His name is Jonathan Eig. He's an author. Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It was fun talking to you, and we'll do it again soon.